Hello all, welcome to the show. I'm Gus Gagliardi and this is Fire Code Tech. On Fire Code Tech, we interview fire protection professionals from all different careers and backgrounds in order to provide insight and a resource for those in the field. My goal is to help you become a more informed fire protection professional. Fire Code Tech has interviews with engineers and researchers, fire marshals, and insurance professionals, and highlights topics like codes and standards, engineering systems, professional development, and trending topics in the industry. So if you're someone who wants to know more about fire protection or the fascinating stories of those who are in the field, you're in the right place. Hello all, welcome to episode 20 of Fire Code Tech. In this episode we have Rodney Slaughter. Rodney is the president and CEO of the National Fire Heritage Center. Rodney spent the bulk of his career as a deputy to the California State Fire Marshal. In this episode of Fire Code Tech, we get into Rodney's interesting career in fire and life safety. We talk about some of the interesting things that the National Fire Heritage Center is collecting and how you can get involved. In this episode, we talk about the interesting parallel between anthropology and social sciences and fire and life safety. Rodney breaks down some of the interesting pieces of the collection of the National Fire Heritage Center and how some of them date back to the 1800s. We speak about the origins of Rodney's career in the fire service and how he got started as a fire and crash rescue firefighter. I ask about Rodney's interesting consulting work he does with organizational culture. If you're a fan of the show and you want to help us out, do me a favor and go follow us on social media and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. If you want to check out more about Fire Code Tech, you can find us at our website at firecodetech.com. Let's get into the show. Thank you for coming on the show. It's a pleasure to have you here.
My pleasure, Gus. I appreciate this.
Awesome. Well, I wanted to get started, Rodney, with a little bit about your background and your origin and how you found yourself in the fire service, if you wouldn't mind.
I kind of think that the best way, because I have over a 40-year career in the fire service, is to start present and work my way backwards. So, right now I am the president of the National Fire Heritage Center in Emmitsburg, Maryland, just outside of Gettysburg. And the National Fire Heritage Center mission is to preserve the history of the American fire service. From that position, I just retired in 2017 as a deputy state fire marshal with the Office of the State Fire Marshal in California and a division chief within the CAL FIRE firefighting organization. I had been working for both the State Fire Marshal's Office and CAL FIRE for a good 24 years. And prior to that, I was a United States Air Force crash rescue firefighter. How I started, which is your question, is back in the 70s. I graduated from high school in 72. I inducted into the Air Force right at the end of the Vietnam War. And the Air Force at the time had a job guarantee program. So I could go into the military with a guarantee of becoming a firefighter, which would help me find a career after I got out of the military and I could keep working. So that's kind of my genesis. That's how I started.
Wow, that's fascinating. So you begin your career in the Air Force in crash and rescue firefighting, and so how does your role in the fire service lead you to kind of more of the code enforcement division or that role at the fire marshal's office? Yeah, how does that transition kind of work from?
Well, it's interesting. So going into the Air Force as a crash rescue firefighter was an end to a means. So my academic interest is in cultural anthropology. And I was working minimum wage part-time jobs right out of high school, trying to support myself and realizing that I wasn't going to get very far in the shape that I was in. So I joined the Air Force basically because I could get a guaranteed job as a firefighter, and I would get the GI benefits of full tuition for going to college. So that's what paid for my anthropology degree.
Wow, that's interesting about your fascination with anthropology and kind of how that's been a through line in your career from my research. So when did you know that you had this fascination with anthropology and just the culture of things? How did you kind of find out that that was something that really piqued your interest?
I was president of the science club in high school, and I was interested originally in paleontology and geology. and I switched into anthropology, as a teenager. So you explore lots of things when you're a teenager. What's interesting is the segue from becoming a firefighter, working for the military, and really having a blast, working as a firefighter around the country. I was stationed in Miami, Florida for a year. I was stationed in Honolulu, Hawaii for 3.5 years, and I worked as a civilian firefighter in Sacramento, California. And that segue, once I finished my degree in cultural anthropology to the state fire marshal's office, is they were looking for people that had a 4-year fire engineering degree. And I've been a little bit of an odd duck in that organization, in that I don't come from the perspective of engineering. I come from the perspective of social science. The way I ended up getting the job was the fire marshal himself in my third interview asked me, what does anthropology have to do with code enforcement? And my reply to that is that the anthropology studies the pattern of human behavior. And when you're doing code enforcement work, different occupancies present different problems that you have to watch out for. There's different patterns that occur. And that would make me a more effective code enforcement person than just an engineer. And they hired.
That's a good answer. I like that. I like hearing about your days in aircraft rescue firefighting. That's very fascinating. It sounds like I feel it that being in the fire service is already something that people kind of have this notional idea of, but they don't really understand or maybe don't grasp the full implications of. So I just like in my head, I feel like I too have some question of I don't really know what a day in the life of an aircraft rescue firefighter looks like. Yeah, I mean, is it just like the same pretty much as the traditional fire service, or would you categorize that differently?
Yeah, so I'm working for the Department of Defense, essentially the U.S. Air Force, and as a civilian at an Air Force base. So it really doesn't look any different than firefighting anywhere else. And we'll get to talk about fire culture, but for the most part, I was an engineer on the first run engine that went out of the station for structural fires. But we cross-manned vehicles. So if there was something happening on the flight line, I had another set of turnout clothes already on another truck, a crash rescue truck, that would then go out onto the flight line. So depending on the type of emergency was dependent upon which truck I jumped on with my crew.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to something you touched on that I think rings true for me as a fire protection engineer who's, studied and interested in the phenomenon of fire and the way humans react with it. And I just wanted to say that I really like that point of the culture and the human behavior around fire and how that helps you in code enforcement. I think it's one of the more interesting parts of the analysis of fire protection systems and how we design safer buildings and safer fire protection systems is this human behavior piece that is understanding how truly people interact. And so, yeah, I just wanted to say that I think that's really fascinating. And yeah, I think that's neat that you drew that parallel between these two subjects, culture and the way that we live as a society, and this phenomenon that can be a catastrophe at times that we know as fire. But maybe that's a long exposition to say. I like what you said, and if you have any more on that, I'd love to hear it. But
I was just looking for a job. I knew the question was going to come up. I anticipated the question, so it helped me tremendously. In your world, in fire engineering world, most of your clients, I'm sure, would just like to be told what are the code regulations, what are the code requirements, and the performance-based codes. People just want to know what the answer is, and they want the same answer time after time. But we also have the ability beyond prescriptive codes for performance-based codes. And I think that that's where the social science part of this starts coming more into play when you're designing a performance-based system. How do humans react? And it's not just for the occupants. Our codes are not just built for the occupants, but they're also built for the safety of the first responders responding to an emergency of that structure. So, I think that my world as a social scientist becomes more important in a performance-based code system than in a prescriptive code system.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic of performance-based design because it's something that's becoming more and more prevalent. And if you take a look globally, performance-based design in other countries is a mainstay of how people conduct business and design safe buildings is performance-based design. But it's something I'm fascinated with. Essentially, effectively all of the designs I've ever been a part of have been prescriptive in nature, so I'm fascinated with performance-based design, and I think that in my career, I will see, a growth in people's willingness to accept performance-based design. But yeah, I think that's an interesting note about culturally how it performance-based design is more significant of a concern in understanding the human dynamic, if that makes sense, if I said that correctly. Anyway, so I wanted to get into, not to belabor too much on your history in the fire service, but I'm just really fascinated with your career, and I just wanted to talk about, I don't know if you had a particular project or fire that was indelible in your mind from your career in the fire and crash rescue firefighting.
He had suggested this question earlier. What was it in my career? What was a pivotal moment or an important moment? And I don't think that there's anything surprising on the firefighting side. And I only did that for the first 14 years of my career. The lion's share of my career was working with the California State Fire Marshal's Office. And I would say probably the significant event for me was a couple of years into my employment there. There was a massive layoff. I had gotten a pink slip. And what's interesting is because I worked for the state fire marshal's office, they didn't require us to have certifications because we were the certifying body for everybody else. So when the layoff notice came and we were out looking for jobs and competing with other people coming out of college with engineering degrees and things like that. None of us had certifications that would allow us even to get interviewed. So my pivot point, they rescinded layoff notice. But my pivot point from all of that was really kind of a critical point in my career when I realized that just being a firefighter and just working a couple of years as a deputy state fire marshal was not enough to keep me gainfully employed. So I started at that point, probably I was about 35 years old, 40 years old, starting to develop other skill sets within, the fire marshal's office that could help me stay gainfully employed. So I started writing grants, I was doing regulations, legislation, I started doing a lot of other things other than just code enforcement related stuff. Primarily though, my focus was in training, developing curriculum, instructional design, teaching classes up and down the state of California. That was pretty much my bread and butter work. That was work that I can take with me and have taken with me as a consultant at the same time.
From research, I see that you had taught some courses in some emerging fields like photovoltaics, but what are some of the other courses that you were involved in teaching for the state fire
So
marshal?
this is kind of interesting that you were able to research and tease all of that out of my background. So when I had a new fire marshal come on board, Ronnie J. Coleman, became our state fire marshal, and he basically merged the California State Fire Marshal's Office with the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection to become the Cal Fire agency it is today. And working for Chief Coleman, I was writing grants. I was writing grants on subject areas. So one of my first projects was on tire fires. I became a national expert on tire fires, researching it. I hired researchers, fire protection engineers actually out of Berkeley. Brady Williamson was doing some computer modeling on tire fires, tall stacks of fires. We had, areas in California with 20 million tires in them. So I started out in the curriculum design business, developing a training program for fire prevention and mitigation for tire fires. That led me into other projects, urban wildland interface. I've got a 300-page textbook on, California's I-zone fire prevention mitigation for the urban wildland interface. Electric vehicles in the mid 90s, when California had a zero emission mandate to train firefighters on electric vehicle emergencies, was seen as a mechanism to ensure that the public felt that electric vehicles were safe, knowing that the emergency responders could deal with any kind of emergency with electric vehicles. And then that led me into other alternative fuel vehicles. So I have another program out on alternative energy programs. And I've always been fascinated with photovoltaics. So basically, when you put solar panels on top of a roof of a house or a big box store, that you have the information you need as a firefighter on how to deal with that. And so that was another grant funded project. So I've had a number of really, really interesting grant funded projects that are relatable to the environment, which is kind of a focal point for me. Environmental protection, energy production, waste management. All of these things then become fire-related problems, and how do we solve those in the fire service? So those were very specialized courses that I was doing for the fire marshal's office.
Yeah, as somebody who has an affinity for fire suppression systems, uh, yeah, I really am interested in what you said about tire fires. I know that they are high hazard materials and probably, some of the most dangerous things that you could have stacked up end on end. So yeah, I'm interested. What kind of findings did you have from this research? I think that sounds like such an interesting story to be working with fire protection. I guess they would be researchers or scientists in Berkeley. Wow, that sounds like a movie. That sounds cool.
Yeah, exactly. Because we would pile tires up and torch them, and we would measure the radiant heat flux that came off the tires, and then Dr. Williamson would then calculate and extrapolate, how much separation needs to be between piles and things like that. It was very interesting work, but what's I think fascinating how things come back around, decades later, is I just added somebody to the board of directors for the National Fire Heritage Center by the name of Dwight Williams. Dwight Williams actually responded to one of the tire fires that we had in California 20 some years ago. And we had a nice little chat about that. He's now working with me on the National Fire Heritage Center as a board member. There's a lot of information about tire fires. You had a significant one in Saint Amab in Canada, and that case study, as well as others, Winchester, Virginia, and around the country, gave a lot of credence to the need to have some kind of a plan for protecting these large tire piles. The chemistry of the tires have changed significantly as well, and they've come up with better ways of recycling them so they're not stacked up the way they used to be. I could give you a whole class. It's an 8-hour class if you want me to.
Wow, that sounds, yeah. I mean, most people would be like, I'm good, but yeah, that actually sounds pretty
I've
intriguing.
given it about 20 years. It's been a long time, but I still have all the material.
That's awesome. I wanted to also touch on the photovoltaics thing because, yeah, I mean, energy storage systems and, the role that photovoltaics are playing in the environment of the fire service and fire prevention is still very prevalent. I had an ad, I guess, on, I forget what social media it was on today, and it was a roof shingle that was essentially a photovoltaic cell or some sort of solar generation mechanism
Right?
the whole roof just looked like a glass shingle, if you will.
right.
And so uh, I was just thinking, man, that probably presents a pretty significant hazard for somebody trying to put water on a fire, or when that system reaches the end of life. I wonder if it fails gracefully. I'm not thinking that it probably does.
The solar systems take quite a while to degrade, and the system that you just described, tiled photovoltaics, then have to be wired together underneath in the attic. So each shingle or stack of shingles that they install then needs to be wired underneath, as opposed to having panels that are put on top of the roofing system and then wired together on the top and then sent to the inverter and to the electrical system of the unit. So there's so many different styles and types, and this is an area I think if I were fire protection engineering, that I would want to keep an eye on, because they have basically windows that glazing that goes on the exterior walls that can generate electricity as well. And there's lots of examples of that in use around the country. So I think photovoltaics and the fact that we need to start decarbonizing our economy, that we need to find a way of generating more sustainable energy sources. I think that the photovoltaics is one, is along with wind power and so many others that we really need to pay a lot more attention to. I think that you're going to see too, and we'll talk about trends later on, but I think the trend is going to be to decentralize a lot of the energy production, that your home or your business can generate enough electricity to sustain itself. And it could still be tied to the grid and sell, energy back to the grid and that kind of thing. So the smart grid systems that are coming up into the future are going to be very interesting for people like yourself working in fire protection engineering.
Yeah, I agree with you. Photovoltaics and alternative energy is not going anywhere, and so we definitely have to keep an eye on these hazards and just these construction means and methods as we move forward. I guess is the only answer. But so I wanted to get into a little bit more on your work with the National Fire Heritage Center, and just talk about for those. I know you already gave like an overview description of what that is, but maybe for the people who aren't aware, if you could go a little bit more in detail on the work that you all are doing. I think it's a really neat historical perspective on the fire service and fire prevention.
Yeah, so I'm kind of excited. I just picked up the gavel for the president's office of the National Fire Heritage Center, and the National Fire Heritage Center started out with a U.S. Fire Administration study, back in the late '90s. And they funded the study of, where does fire history go to? There are no national organizations that are collecting the history of the fire service. The Smithsonian doesn't collect it. NFPA doesn't collect it. There's no organization that really has, a sustainable archive. So they developed a document. It's called Heritage Hall. It's a proposal to archive the history of the fire service and fire protection disciplines in America. And so what's really important about that title, it's not just about firefighting. It's not just about the fire trucks and the hoses and nozzles and all of that. It also has a lot to do with your field as well, fire protection engineering, as well as laboratories and testing and things of that nature. There's a lot of historic information that is out there that are in the hands of people who are long in the tooth, like myself, who've been around for a really long time, and they've collected massive amounts of material. And when they start passing away or having to downsize into smaller homes and that kind of thing, their relatives come in and have no idea what the value of any of this collection is. And they either start throwing it away or they're looking for fire museums or someplace to place it. And so the National Fire Heritage Center basically is going to step up to protect these documents. And certainly we're looking at, the history of the fire service starts back in Ben Franklin's era. and colonial America. But we've been in lockstep. Ben Franklin also started the insurance industry. So we've been in lockstep with the insurance industry, laboratories, engineering companies, things like that. And the data that's been collected or that was developed needs to be collected so that way people can research, go back and see where did this code requirement come from, for example, and what event actually started this code requirement, exiting hardware, for example, or 1 hour corridor doors, those kinds of things occurred in the code because something, typically somebody had died. Or many people have died, or firefighters have been injured. So going back and collecting this kind of information, I think, is informative for people today to be able to plan for the future. We can go back and see the evolution of sprinkler systems, for example, or fire alarm systems, and then kind of decide, well, how can we make this program better? What did we miss historically that a technology wasn't available or material wasn't available, but it is today that could then be used for a future application? So I think the National Fire Heritage Center has a very big role into collecting as much material as we possibly can. Now, having said that, we're still a very young organization. We're still, trying to find our footing. We have no federal funding. We have no major funding source right now, so we're campaigning for people to make donations and people become members of the organization. There's a membership button and a donation button on our webpage, fireheritageusa.org. And that helps a lot because we need to scan material, we need to house the material, keep the material on storage. It costs about $600 a year per cubic foot of material to have it stored. So when you calculate, we've got over 15,000 pieces already cataloged, and we've probably got another 15,000 pieces that we're unboxing right now. That is a lot of storage, and that there's a huge expense in maintaining that storage alone. Not to say, to preserve it. So some of the material is so old, 1800s. I think we have two pieces that are in the 16 and 1700s. That stuff needs to be preserved as well. So we're putting together a catalog, and we're moving our catalog to an online data system called Past Perfect. It's a museum quality system, and we're going to connect that to our website so people like yourself can actually, if you're in school and you're doing a paper or a thesis, or if you're in a design capacity like yourself and you need some information of what happened in the past, you could go into our archive and you could basically find it electronically. So we're trying to scan as much as we can and get it posted to the web. Our goal is to have the new system up and running the first quarter of 2021. And we're looking at a partnership with Google, and Google is going to help us scan some of our more rare articles.
That's incredible. I love hearing about that. Yeah, I think one of the great points that you touched on was fire prevention, and the fire service is something that is built on tragedy. And I think that through my education at Oklahoma State University, we were instructed on some of these historic fires, and so I think history is an integral piece of what it means to be in fire prevention and the fire service. So naturally, the preservation of these irreplaceable pieces of historical importance it's a noble pursuit without a doubt. I think that's great. I'm so glad to hopefully shine what little light I can on it for those who don't know about it. I know that the way that I found out about the National Fire Heritage Center was through a really riveting picture of students at Oklahoma State University learning about fire protection. I think it was like in the 40s or something. And I was just thinking, wow, my program that I am part of is nearly 100 years old for individuals who are wanting to learn fire science and be in the fire protection industry, or any fire and life safety pursuit. So yeah, I think that's so great.
Yeah, our mission is important. I'm excited about because I'm not only helping, develop the organization, but develop the organizational culture that goes along with the National Fire Heritage Center. So I have a really great team of board members who are fire service related themselves and board of trustees members as well. And I've been diversifying the board, so we have a lot more females on board, and we have a lot younger people on board as well, which is kind of important. And the new voices in the organization have given the organization a whole new energy. So I'm really excited about what 2021 is going to look like.
It sounds like you guys are really taking the charge on the digital side of things as far as the archival and just the cataloging of these different historical pieces. But yeah, I didn't know if you guys had any thoughts of maybe having like a physical museum location at any point. Is that something you guys have talked about or had thoughts of?
Right now we're in Emmitsburg, which is really considered Firetown, USA. So Emmitsburg is where the National Fire Academy is. Right now, the Vigilant Hose Company is hosting us. They have an activities building. We're on the second floor of the activities building. They've been very gracious in allowing us to start building our collection there. And as the collection grows out, we're looking for property. So definitely having a building of our own is in the cards, and something we'll be exploring more this year. But until we have a stable and reliable funding stream coming in, talking about a building right now is kind of wishful thinking. I guess would be the best way to describe it.
Sure.
We're wishfully that one day we're going to have enough money that comes in and enough funding streams coming together that allow us to build a building and be able to house this collection, because it's going to be huge when you think about all of the material that's out there in your own library, for example, right? Think of somebody who's been around like John Bryant, who's teaching at the Maryland Fire Rescue Institute. And what we're doing is when we get a collection from a specific individual, like John Bryant, Robbie Robertson, Ronnie Coleman, we keep the bibliography of what their collection is all about together. So if you were doing some kind of a research, so for example, Ronnie Coleman was an early adopter and proponent for residential sprinkler systems. You may want to look at the Ronnie Coleman collection to see what he's read and the things that he's developed that informed his decision to hang into, become a champion for residential sprinkler systems, as an example.
That's great. I love that it's categorized and you find somebody who is really a hero in your preferred area of the field, and you can kind of delve into what they thought was meaningful to consume as far as literature on the subject. So that's really incredible. So for people who don't know, I've taken a look at the website, and yeah. So for people who don't know, what kind of media it can be found in the collection, because there's quite a diverse array.
So when you talk about the history of the fire service, you're talking about, we're looking at preserving the written documents primarily, but also there's an oral history. A lot of the history of the fire service itself among firefighters was passed on from person to person. It was never written down. It was the war stories, of how they survived a particular incident, and it's those survival stories that you hang on to as a firefighter that keep you out of trouble in the next incident, right? And so there's an oral history segment. There is the written history, but as the written history then becomes more diversified into electronic media, print media, videos, audio, all of this stuff then becomes collectible, at the point that they emerge as the new technologies.
I thought it was pretty interesting. For those who want to take a look, I would say go online and check out the website because you can kind of click through the different pieces and it's all available for people to take a look at from what I could see. And so if you have interest, go dig through some of the pieces that are available. It's a big old database filled with lots of stuff that any code nerd, self-professed code nerd, would probably want to take a look at. So
Exactly, including Heritage Hall. So the original documentation by the U.S. Fire Administration, Heritage Hall, is also on the website. So if you want to know about our strategic direction, you could read through that. It's pretty interesting, and I'm reemphasizing this original document as we go into 2021 because it's got lots of important things that we need to accomplish.
that's great. So yeah, I was talking about the piece that really sparked my interest in the National Fire Heritage Center, but I didn't know if you also had a piece that you found that was truly compelling, maybe just for your own interests. Or I know you've given some examples so far, but I didn't know if you had one that was near and dear to you.
Well, so as a social scientist and as a researcher, the kinds of stuff that I see the National Fire Heritage Center collecting isn't just the engineering stuff and the lab reports and things like that, but it's also some of the other research that helps keep firefighters safe. For example, there is lots of social science research. And there's an article I've got sitting here, performing under uncertainty: the contextualization, engagement, and wildland firefighting. And basically, this is an article, a research paper that was done to look at how we communicate with one another on a fire scene and how do we maintain a level of safety. So the hierarchy of the fire service suggests that you just take orders. You don't provide input into that decision making model. That model is beginning to change significantly. As they've studied wildland firefighting and as they've studied structural firefighting, industrial firefighting, they're discovering that there needs to be a level of trust, a level of respect, and a higher level of communication among team members that will keep them safe in the long run. And that's being documented now in a lot of the social science research that's being conducted at the same time.
I like that. I like that. That's something that people might not initially come to mind is that it's not just these documents about historic fires and whatnot, but it's also some documents that have a social perspective on the fire service and fire prevention. So, if people want to get involved, donate, or if they have something that they might want to send to the museum, how would they do that?
They would contact any of the board members or the executive board. But we also have an archivist on the ground in Emmitsburg, Maryland, and his name is Dick DeVore. And Dick is a retired fire chief, and all of us, just donate our time. We're all volunteer. We're an all volunteer organization. Dick goes into the archives a couple of times a week, pulls things out of boxes, checks our mail, that kind of thing. He is actually a pretty good point of contact, and his contact information is on the website. He's the chief archivist, or archive at Fire Heritage Center. Excuse me, fireheritageusa.org. That's his email address. So you can just make contact with somebody in the organization and arrange for a drop off or a pickup.
That's great. I saw a post, I think, today on LinkedIn, and it was somebody who had almost collected all of the old uniform building codes. They were keeping an eye out for just a couple more copies. But yeah, for people who maybe aren't aware of the history of what the model codes were before the International Building Code, there used to be a couple different model codes utilized throughout the U.S. in addition to all of the more specific regional amendments and/or state adoptions. But I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, that alone could be an entire career, just keeping track of all those code changes, the evolution of the code, right?
For sure, without a doubt. So, Rodney, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the consulting work that you're involved with, and how you help companies talk about how to create sustainable and meaningful cultures. Yeah, I think that's interesting. It's kind of unique. I don't think I've ever seen a fire and life safety professional with that sort of interest or passion.
Right, exactly, exactly. You know, there's I don't even know where to start with this. And I guess the best place to start was in my in the beginning. So working as a civilian firefighter in Sacramento, California, I was going to school studying anthropology, and a turning point for me was a book that came out by Terrence Steele and Alan Kennedy called Corporate Culture: The Rites and Rituals of Corporate America. And I through that book, I instantly saw the application of my anthropology to organizational application. And my assistant chief that I was working for at the time was tasked with trying to change the attitudes and behaviors of the firefighters that were working in the department. And knowing my interest in this work, he asked me to design a program. And so we sat down and we defined the core values of my shift. I was using we had a 2-shift system then at the time. The other shift was my control group because they weren't doing anything. And my shift basically sat down and defined the core values. What was it that made us a success? And once we've identified what those values were and we defined it, then we came up with a system that reinforced those values. So every time we gave a training class, everybody was tasked to teach some aspect of firefighting throughout the course of the month. If you're teaching hydraulics, fireground hydraulics, or SCBA systems, or whatever, you had to do it within the context of those core values. And the program became extremely popular. Everybody on the shift was really excited, and we really made an impact in terms of engagement, and in terms of employee morale, and in terms of what the firefighters saw in their management. And so it was a pretty impactful program. And that success is what kept me into, wanting to stay in this area for a long time. I just finished my degree with Pepperdine University as an organizational development. I've got my master's of science in organizational development, and there my foundation as an anthropologist is then amplified with the organizational development side of things. It's hard to answer your question specifically because it's a very general. If I go into an organization, just as I did last year, I went into a combination fire department and did a cultural assessment. And as I'm collecting the data, I recognize the fact that the volunteers and the career firefighters don't respect each other. The young guys don't respect the old guys. The men don't respect the women. The story goes on. Everybody was in silos within this organization. So we went back to, once we've done the initial analysis of the culture, went back and did workshops on respect. What does respect look like? How do you feel about that? And giving the people a mechanism to define their own terms and share that definition with one another, so everybody's operating from the same sheet of music. Essentially, so that's kind of the crux of the work that I do, and it's easy for me going into a fire organization because they don't have to teach me first what it means to be a firefighter. I've already done that job, so I know essentially and basically, what firefighting entails. Shift work, going out on campaign fires. I've done all those kinds of things. I've worked as an engineer. I've worked on the prevention side of things. So I pretty much have a pretty good idea. So it's an organizational culture that I don't have to be explained to. But every organization has a different culture. The small combination fire department I did in Northern California would be completely different than, say, the Chicago Fire Department. I mean, the culture is completely different. So that's the aspect for firefighting, and we could go back to that for a second. But on other organizations that I might not have as much experience in, I've done banking, I've done medical, I've done some light industrial. I'm going into those organizations pretty much, wide-eyed. There's like so much going on when I walk into a new business that I'm absorbing things like crazy, and it's really a lot more fun for me to go outside the fire service and work in organizational cultures outside, and discover what they're all about. And that work is, that is just as fulfilling for me. Either way, I enjoy it a lot.
That's very interesting. It sounds like an interesting role, kind of helping promote being inclusive and also kind of workshopping different companies' strengths and weaknesses. So
Right?
yeah, I bet it's got to be a pretty different each time. It sounds like I'm sure there's no one size fits all for
Exactly.
fixing company culture.
Yeah.
It sounds like something that's pretty unique.
And it's something that, like, you work in an organization, it's something that the organizational leadership needs to work on every single day. It's not something that, and certainly it happens, culture just develops the behaviors, the patterns of behaviors that people have organizationally develop over a period of time, oftentimes led by the personality of the leadership to begin with. So my suggestion is that we go into these organizations purposefully, decide what kind of culture that we want to have, and build towards that culture. So in your line of work, innovation would be very important. And if you had a leadership team that squashed your innovative tendencies, then that would pretty much kill your desire to keep working for the organization. So, the culture and the leadership kind of work hand in hand, and it's really fascinating. It really is a fascinating area.
Definitely, innovation is a big thing at the company that I work for. It's interesting, because there's varying levels of how much a company will buy into the latest and greatest technology or maybe alternative approaches to design or just some of these sorts of things that, a company can take a stance on. Hey, we do want to be on the more of the cutting edge of what technology can do and push the limit, or no, we're a more conservative company and we want to be maybe less innovative and more reliable. So I think that's an interesting point you touched on there. Anyways, well, I wanted to get into a couple of professional development topics to round out our conversation and just yeah, button up the interview. But yeah, I always love asking people because I feel like everybody always has a different answer, and it's always interesting. Is what do you see as a trend in fire and life safety, or just maybe in a more broad sense in business, right? Yeah. Do you have like a finger on the pulse of what you would call a trend right now? I know we talked about a couple things.
Well, you mentioned the word inclusiveness, and in today's environment, diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think, are going to be really important going forward. Bringing other voices into the room, and this again comes from that anthropological perspective, is that different cultures, different people from around the world have a different way of solving problems. Men and women look at problems completely differently, right? And so, how they come up with solving problems. So I think that the strength of many of our organizations and many of our things that we should be looking forward to in the future is being able to you know bring people that aren't traditionally. So let's be frank. The fire service in America is predominantly a white male avocation. And even in the engineering section, I'm starting to see more diversity, but it has not always been that way. Bringing people in from that's not white, that's not male, that's not, over 50. That's kind of an important thing where you have younger voices, you have female voices, you have people from different cultures coming in, and I think that is going to add your ability to solve larger and larger problems. So that's the first thing. Does that work for you?
Definitely. I mean, I totally resonate with what you're saying. The more different kind of voices and opinions that are at the table, people's perspectives vary pretty widely.
Yeah,
And
there's lots of supporting research, for that. And then the other part of this is technology, because what we're doing is largely technologically driven, and the safeguards that we can provide people within the fire engineering perspective, I think is going to happen through technology, and even firefighting itself is already being impacted. It wasn't that long ago where they were going to outlaw drones, over wildland fires, and now they're using drones to help identify the wildland fires and the perimeter of the fire and things like that. It seems incredibly ridiculous that we're still sending live human beings into very dangerous, life-threatening situations as firefighters, where we now have robotic systems that could do the same thing, automatic sprinkler systems and detection systems. All of that I think is going to only improve and get better. Building materials are going to change, so it's not just the people in engineering, but there are inventors out there that are using new materials or new combination of materials to come up with better systems. And so technology, I think, is going to be a big factor in the future.
without a doubt, it's pretty interesting. Even in my short career, some of the advances in technology and what's been happening as far as suppression and detection. So I get really excited about the system side of things. Seeing some different innovations like electronically controlled sprinklers and some of the more advanced means of detection and initiation are some things that I kind of get revved up about. But yeah, I definitely hear what you're saying. That makes a lot of sense.
I've had this philosophy, and I've shared this over the years, that the fire service is pretty much a generalist kind of occupation. Occupationally, firefighters are electricians, they're carpenters, they're roofers. They work a lot in the trades, plumbing, that kind of thing. But we've grown more and more over the past couple of decades. I've been in the fire service. It's more academic areas. And I think it's important for people entering into the industry at large is to appreciate that it's not just one thought process. A variety of disciplines make the strength of what the fire service community and industry is all about. So whether you're interested in, English or, physics or biology, anthropology, or any of the social sciences, all of these things academically have a value and a place in the fire service industry. And I say industry at large, not just firefighting, but fire protection, fire engineering, and fire research. So I think that having an appreciation for somebody who comes in with a degree in fire science and bachelor's degree in administration, public administration, that's kind of the standard profile for a lot of people academically. But I guess what I'm suggesting is people like myself who have a different background in social science or English. I taught grant writing. I traveled around North America, basically training firefighters how to write grants. I would have a fire truck mechanic with grease under his fingernails, who could barely construct a sentence, write successful grants. So, getting people to learn a little bit about grammar and English and honing their writing skills is like incredibly important. So, I think that we really need to expand our mind in terms of what a fire person looks like. A fire person can come from a wide range of disciplines and backgrounds, and be very effective.
It's a really interesting point. I've never really thought about that before. I was wondering on how much to try to butter you up to get you on the show, and you were saying, "Oh, I don't know how compelling my background is because it's not conventional." And I wanted to say this, and I typed it out and I deleted it, but I wanted to say, I think some of the best backgrounds and careers in fire service and fire preventions are the people who come from non-traditional means and methods to make it to the field. Fire protection and the fire service is not a really, I mean, maybe the fire service, but not fire protection engineering is really a thing that most people aspire to be as, 3 or 4 year olds. You don't hear any kids saying, "Oh, I want to be a fire protection engineer." So I think it's interesting that a lot of people do come from various
Well,
backgrounds.
because the kids don't see the guys behind the closed door. They don't see, they're not out front like the firefighters are.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, so what would you recommend to professionals for resources? It sounds like you are a subject matter expert on writing research grants and some different areas that are maybe not as prevalent in the industry. I'd love to hear about where you like to go to get information about these things or just about fire and life safety in general. Yeah, I didn't know if you had any tips for the listeners.
Not necessarily. I think that, this is another one of those technology things that there's more and more information available on the internet than ever before. And everybody's now carrying a computer in their hand that has more capacity than the first spaceships that we sent to the moon, right? And so I think the information is really available. There's lots of information that's available out there right now. I think that for people who are going to be successful in the future is to take the available information that exists and recombine it into new ideas and innovate, off of the stuff that's already been done. And from my perspective, I would say keep an open mind and be inquisitive. Just use your imagination and use your natural and innate curiosity about things in the world, and follow up on it, and discover things for yourself.
Well, Rodney, I think that's a perfect end cap to the interview. I want to thank you so much for your time today, speaking with me and coming on the podcast. And yeah, thanks again,
I
sir.
appreciate it, Gus. It was really fun talking to you today.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Be sure to share the episode with a friend if you enjoyed it. Don't forget that fire protection and life safety is serious business. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are by no means a professional consultation or a codes and standards interpretation. Be sure to contact a licensed professional if you are getting involved with fire protection and or life safety. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.